Pastor Yo from Nelson Avenue. We are starting this podcast series, hoping that the things we talk about in this series will be helpful, not just to Christians, but also to others. We're in a very unique time in our lives and in human history with the COVID-19 pandemic happening, and we thought, let's try something that might address maybe questions people have, fears that they're dealing with. So stay tuned for this podcast, but also for upcoming podcasts as we seek to really listen to what maybe God's saying to us in this time. So in this podcast, we're looking at things that I'm learning, maybe you're learning during this COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to take something that I talked about this past Sunday on our church's Zoom services. And I was trying to bring across that we need to be listening to all kinds of information these days. Information from our health officials, government officials. I'm sure many of us are online looking at the news, hearing what's going on in our communities, our country, the world. And that's all really important information. For me, all those voices are needed, but the voice I need to hear most of all is the voice of God. What's God saying in this time? Or can I also be listening to what He is saying amidst all the other voices maybe I should be listening to? Maybe some voices need to be louder, some quieter, but what's the voice of God saying? And I take this because in different parts of the Bible, when people are in trouble or people are struggling, I think it's the voice of God that they want so much to hear, that they actually need to hear. So I'm thinking about this story of Job in the Old Testament. Maybe you know the story. Job is suffering tremendously. The accuser or the evil one has brought suffering into his life, incredible suffering. And for about 30 chapters, he's listening to the voices of his friends they start talking to him, but then they really start arguing with him and telling him, Job, it's all your faults. All this happened to you because of some sin or wrong in your life. And we find out toward the end of the Bible, or toward the end of this book, that all of those voices that he was listening to were not right. They weren't correct. God says, I'm actually angry with your friends for all the advice they gave. And then God comes and doesn't really answer Job's question so much, but he comes and he shows Job that he, God, Yahweh, is in charge. He's running the world. And when I read that story, think about that story, I think that's what we need to hear. The voice of God in the midst of this pandemic. God, who is the one who made and created the world, who keeps the world going, who has a plan for this world. We need to hear His voice in this time. His voice of love, His voice of grace, His voice of there is a plan, there is a purpose. And God has you and I and the whole world in His plan, in His hands at this time. So I want us to be listening for the voice of God in these uncertain, but with God, very certain times, these days of pandemic. What's the voice of God saying to us? Let's listen to these words from Job chapter 38. After all the friends have been talking, God comes and we read this. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it?" And God continues to ask questions of Job, reminding Job, God's the creator, God's the maker, God's the one in charge of this world. And I want us also in this time of pandemic to hear that voice from God speaking to us like He spoke to Job so many years ago. Thanks for joining us for this podcast. We hope it's been helpful for you. Stay tuned for more episodes coming up. And if you have any feedback for us, if it's been helpful for you, or if there are things that you want me or others to be talking about, do let us know. But until next time, I'll see you then.